The nameplate said Bruce Lee in plain black letters, and the champion knocked it off the table without reading a single one of them. It skidded across the arena floor and came to rest face up in the open, where 10,000 people and a dozen photographers could see exactly whose name was printed on it, and the one man in the building who did not look at it was the man who had just thrown it down. That was the whole of the mistake. Right there in the first 2 seconds, a champion so certain of his own size that he would not spend a glance on a name that was lying at his feet. To understand how a man wins the biggest tournament of his life and then throws away his triumph on a small stranger behind a judge's table, you have to go back about 20 minutes to the final match and to the particular kind of certainty that a lifetime of winning builds in a man who has never once been made to doubt it. His name was Dale Corrigan, and he was that year the loudest thing in American karate. 6'4", lantern-jawed, built like a door, he had come up through the rough open tournaments of the era. Thin gloves, thinner rules, where the biggest and meanest man very often simply was the best man, and Corrigan had been the biggest and meanest in every division he entered for the better part of a decade. He was genuinely good. The story does not work if he was a fraud, and he was not one. He was a legitimately dangerous heavyweight contact champion with fast hands for his size and a right cross that had ended more than one career. He was also a showman who had learned that in America, the man who talks the loudest sells the most tickets, and he had built a whole persona out of contempt for smaller fighters, for softer styles, for anybody whose approach to combat was not simply to be larger and hit harder than the other man. If you want to understand why a champion like that couldn't be bothered to read a nameplate, stay with this, because contempt is a kind of blindness, and Dale Corrigan had spent 10 years training himself not to see anyone he had already decided did not count. The tournament was enormous, an international championship in a packed arena, the kind of event that drew the whole martial arts world and a wall of press. Corrigan had gone through the bracket like weather. In the final, he had beaten a superb Japanese fighter half his size on power and reach and sheer forward pressure, and when they raised his hand, 10,000 people had come up roaring, and he had drunk it in as his due. He had earned the moment. Nobody could take the win from him. What happened next, he did entirely to himself. The judges sat at a row of skirted tables along one edge of the floor, senior masters, federation officials, and seated among them as a guest of honor, a slight man in a black mandarin-collared jacket with a small folded card in front of him that spelled out his name for the crowd and the cameras. He had been invited to help judge and to demonstrate later in the program, and he had watched the whole tournament with a stillness that a couple of the older masters beside him had found more interesting than the fights. He had watched Corrigan win and applauded it, politely, because it had been in its way worth applauding. And that was the thing Corrigan could not stand, though he could not have told you why. High on the win and the noise, walking the edge of the floor to work the crowd, he passed the judges' tables, and he saw the small man in the black jacket applauding him with a calm that did not match the hysteria of the arena. A man clapping the way you clap for a thing you understand completely and are not amazed by, and something about being appraised instead of adored by a man a third his size, in the middle of the greatest moment of his career, turned the triumph in him sour and mean. He stopped. He looked at the small man, and he did not look at the card in front of him, because why would he? And he said, loud enough for the microphones, that it was a funny thing how the people who sat and judged were always the ones who never had the guts to step on the floor themselves. The arena's roar guttered down into something quieter and more uncertain. The small man looked up at him and said nothing. And Corrigan, a showman who could feel a crowd's attention the way other men feel heat, leaned down over the judge's table into the small man's space, and with the back of his hand he knocked the folded nameplate off the table and onto the floor, and said, "Sit there and judge that." The nameplate skidded out across the open floor and stopped, face up in the lights. Stay with this, because in the front rows and along the press line, a strange thing began to happen in the half-second after that card hit the floor. A ripple, a leaning forward, a spreading murmur, because the people close enough to read it had read it, and the photographers had read it through their lenses, and the name printed on the card lying in the middle of the arena floor was beginning to travel backward through the crowd faster than the champion's insult had traveled forward. Everyone was reading the nameplate now, everyone except Dale Corrigan. The small man in the black jacket looked at his own name lying on the floor of the arena, and then he looked up at the champion, and he still said nothing. He simply stood, unhurried, and stepped out from behind the judges' table. And the way he moved as he came around that table changed the arena for everyone who knew how to watch a man move, which in a building full of the best fighters in the world was a great many people. And the murmur that had started with the nameplate now doubled because the serious fighters along the walls were coming up out of their certainty all at once. Corrigan did not read any of it. He saw a small judge foolish enough to stand up, and he was delighted. He stepped back into the open floor, into the space where his name was still echoing, and he spread his arms to the crowd, and he told them he would give the little judge exactly the lesson he'd been asking for from the safety of his chair. The small man walked out to meet him and stopped a few feet away, hands loose at his sides, and said the only thing he said before it began. He said quietly, "Pick your name up when we are finished." And Corrigan heard it as nonsense, as the babble of a man about to be embarrassed, because he still had not understood that the nameplate on the floor and the man in front of him were the same fact. Here is the part worth staying for, because Corrigan threw the best techniques of his life over the next 40 seconds, and the crowd never saw a single one of them land, and neither did Corrigan, because they didn't. He led with the right cross, the famous one, the one that had ended careers, a real one, fast and heavy, no courtesy in it, and the small man did not slip it, and he did not step back. He met it. His lead hand came up and touched the inside of Corrigan's driving forearm, not blocking it, receiving it, sticking to it, redirecting its line a few degrees, so the enormous punch slid past his head into the air, and his hand did not leave Corrigan's arm. That was the thing nobody in the crowd understood, and every trapping man in the building did. He stuck. When Corrigan's other hand came, the small man's second hand was already there, receiving that one too, and now both of the champion's arms were in contact with the small man's, and he was reading them through the touch, feeling the pressure and the intention flow down the limbs a beat before they became technique, the way you feel a current by putting your hand in the water. Corrigan did what strong men do. He tried to muscle through it, to overpower the contact with sheer force, and he discovered the thing that trapping does to power, which is that strength needs a free limb to spend itself, and a limb that is stuck to another man's sensitivity is not free, it is just weight, hanging on the end of a shoulder, going wherever the sticking hands send it. The harder Corrigan pushed, the more the small man had to read, and every push became a lever the small man borrowed and returned. Corrigan's own arms began horribly to cross each other, trapped and folded across his own center line, where he could not fire either of them, and for one moment the greatest heavyweight in American karate stood in the middle of an arena with both of his famous hands tangled and jammed and useless, held there by a man half his size who had not thrown a single strike. And the small man showed him, once gently, what the trap was for. Into the opening created by Corrigan's own crossed and helpless arms, the small man's open hand floated up and touched him softly on the jaw, on the exact spot where a strike would have ended everything, and rested there for a quarter of a second, weightless, and withdrew. To the crowd it looked like a strange pause in a fight. To Corrigan, it was a message written directly into his body, in a language he had never learned to read and understood instantly anyway. I am here. I have been here the whole time. I have simply chosen not to. The small man released him then, and stepped back, and let Corrigan have his arms again. And Corrigan, to his credit, was a real fighter, and a real fighter does not quit at the first wall. He came again harder, everything he had, the whole overwhelming forward storm that had won him the tournament an hour before, and it was like a storm hitting water. The small man received all of it, and kept none of it. sticking and redirecting and flowing around the pressure so that every committed technique found air and contact and control but never a target, until the champion's own momentum, spent against nothing, carried him stumbling off his balance, and the small man guided him, a hand at the shoulder. The last few degrees he was already going, and Dale Corrigan fetched up hard against the very judge's table he had leaned over a minute earlier, catching himself on it, breathing like a bellows, having thrown everything a decade had given him and touched nothing at all. The arena was not roaring now. It had gone into the strange, vast hush of 10,000 people who came to see power and have been shown something they have no word for. And in that hush, the small man did not press his advantage, and did not gloat, and did not so much as raise his voice. He simply stood in the open floor, not even breathing hard, and waited. Corrigan pushed himself up off the table and turned around, and his face had changed. Not broken, changed. The contempt was gone out of it, because contempt is a thing you can only afford before you have been shown the truth, and he had just been shown it comprehensively, in front of the whole world, by a man he had not bothered to look at. He stood there, chest heaving, and he did not understand yet who had done this to him. And that was when the crowd, which had been holding it, gave it to him. It started somewhere in the front rows and spread, a chant, the same two words the arena had been full of an hour ago for a different man, except now they were saying a different name, the name that was still lying on the floor of the arena in plain black letters, and it rolled up through 10,000 people until Dale Corrigan could not possibly not hear it. He heard it. And the champion looked down, finally, at the nameplate lying on the floor between them, the one he had knocked there without reading, and he read it now. The crew nearest the floor watched him read it. They watched the two words land. They watched a decade of certainty rearrange itself in a man's face in real time, as he understood at last and all at once that the small judge he had decided did not count was the one name in the entire building that every fighter along those walls had come partly to see, that he had just thrown down the nameplate of and then been dismantled by the most famous martial artist alive. And here is how it ended. And it did not end with a handshake. And it did not end with a lesson spoken out loud, because it did not need either. Dale Corrigan looked at the nameplate on the floor for a long moment, and then this enormous, loud, contemptuous man, in front of 10,000 people who had just been chanting another man's name at him, walked over and bent down and picked the nameplate up off the arena floor. He straightened it in his big hands. He looked at it once more, and he carried it back to the judge's table, and he set it down, upright, in its place, facing the crowd, the way it had been before he swept it off, and he stepped back from it, and he inclined his head once to the small man, a short, stiff nod that cost him more than any bow would have cost a humbler man. Then he turned and walked off the floor, and he did not work the crowd on his way out, and the arena let him go in a silence that was in its own way more respectful than the roar had been. The small man went back to his seat beside his righted nameplate, and after a moment he picked up his pen and made a quiet note on the scoring card, because there was, after all, still a tournament to judge. The demonstration he was scheduled to give later, he gave exactly as planned, calm and precise and generous, and the crowd watched it differently than they would have that morning. And somewhere in the seats Dale Corrigan watched too, having not left, having found a place in the stands, studying now the man he had refused an hour earlier to even look at. He never told the story as a defeat that surprised people who only knew the loud version of him, but the men who knew him after that day said the loud version had mostly gone quiet, and that when the subject came up, he told it plainly and without excuses, and always ended it the same way. He would say that he had won the biggest tournament of his life, and then thrown a man's name on the floor without reading it, and that the man had made him pick it up again, and that in the whole long career that followed, he never forgot the single most important thing he learned in that arena, which was not a technique, and was not even the humbling. It was that the day you decide a person isn't worth looking at is the exact day you stop being able to see the thing that's about to beat you, and that the name you refuse to read is very often the only one you'll remember for the rest of your life,